One of the biggest problems with the consulting industry is that they've been able to sell what in Italian we call fried air, aria fritta. You know, air, when it's fried, it's still air, right? So it's been proven time and again. They're not actually consulting in areas where there's real expertise by that consultant. Governments also have become, in some ways, weaker. We're outsourcing everything, so we're infantilizing. We're literally turning, our government workers into children.
Mariana Mazzucato is een Italiaans-Amerikaanse econoom. Ze pleit in haar werk voor een slimme, innoverende overheid. Maar die overheid kan steeds minder zelf. In plaats daarvan worden overal externe bureaus voor ingehuurd. Het gevolg is dat de overheid nog minder slim wordt en tegelijkertijd de consultant-industrie extreem hard kan groeien.
I don't blame consultants. So I, for decades now, have been writing about how we need to strengthen public sector capacity, which doesn't mean big state or small state. It means smarter, more strategic, capable, flexible, agile. And the point of writing the book was that I actually think it's impossible to do that with the level of outsourcing we see today, both to consulting companies, the famous ones like McKinsey, PwC, KPMG, but also to private sector companies that get public sector contracts. And they benefit from a weak state. There's no incentive for the state to get stronger for these companies because they, of course, are needed more and more as the public sector stops to invest in its own brain. And so what you see is that you have government actors going to the consultants, first of all, sometimes because they haven't invested in their own capacity, but even when they have invested in their own capacity, they prefer to work with the consultants because they're so fearful of making mistakes, this constant attack.
Risk averse. Yeah.
Risk averseness. So, risk averseness in the public sector opens up the way for consultants to come in. And the irony is that they end up, wreaking havoc, making all sorts of mistakes, but they don't pay for the havoc, right? So you've kind of de-risked the process in theory, but actually not. It ends up being anyway the public purse that picks up the mess.
Vandaag hebben we het over de overheid die niks meer zelf kan, omdat ze voortdurend adviesbureaus, managers en ICT'ers inhuurt. Kijk, hier. Het ministerie van Economische Zaken en Klimaat geeft bijna een derde van hun personeelsbudget uit aan externe mensen. En ook bij de Belastingdienst was er een reorganisatie. Door die reorganisatie kwam een aantal vitale processen van de Belastingdienst in gevaar, zoals het innen van belasting. Best wel cruciaal. Hoe kon die directie dit laten gebeuren?
Goedenavond. Bij de top van de Belastingdienst wisten ze te weinig van belastingen.
Oké.
The number of consultants increased dramatically, but also their role changed over time, right?
Advisors and consultants to governments have always existed, right? Which is good because governments can't have all the knowledge. The problem is the consulting industry, which, first of all, is huge. It's currently close to $1 trillion worth globally. And it has evolved over time in the sense that it went from being, in some ways, on the periphery of advising government and companies on the side to going to the center, to actually doing what government should be doing itself.
Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. We have a liftoff.
Er was een tijd dat er genoeg kennis in huis was bij de overheid. Externe adviseurs hoefden alleen op hele specifieke terreinen ingehuurd te worden. De overheid kon hierbij stevig onderhandelen op basis van gelijkwaardigheid. Een goed voorbeeld hiervan was het Apollo-project, de reis naar de maan.
I was really struck how with the moon landing, the Apollo program, there was 400,000 people that got us to the moon, many of which were in the private sector. But what you had was a very confident public agency, NASA, the US space agency, that had a very clear, the challenge was to beat the Russians and Sputnik, right? This is a Cold War challenge. The mission was very clear, getting to the moon and back in a short amount of time. But then there was lots of submissions. They had all these problems they needed to solve. What would the astronauts wear? What would they eat? How would they go to the bathroom? So they knew they needed to work with business in so many different sectors, nutrition, materials, electronics, to solve problems, these very concrete problems. So the government woke up and realized they had to change procurement. Procurement is government purchasing, away from just being cost plus, kind of very static procurement, towards mission-oriented, outcomes-oriented procurement, fixed price, but with incentives for quality improvement and innovation. The guy who actually came up with this very important innovation in NASA on outcomes-oriented procurement, his name was Ernest Brackett. And he said, this is back in the 60s, he said, okay, let's learn what's happening here. We're having to work a lot with others to solve these problems, but look, what's also happening in NASA is we're outsourcing a lot of our brains. We will ultimately, he said, and this is now the quote, be captured by brochuremanship. We will have people coming in and just with a nice little shiny brochure say, hey, work with us, we're smart, and you won't have the intelligence within the government to even know how to work with them, to how to write the terms of reference, how to write the contracts, but even how to understand the area that they need to co-invest and play together. And this was hugely, he had foresight. This is what we have now. We've been captured by PowerPoint.
Adviseurs zijn er altijd geweest, maar in de jaren 80 van Reagan en Thatcher begon de consultant-industrie pas echt te groeien. En die neoliberale gedachte van een kleine overheid werd in de jaren 90 overal omarmd. Zowel door rechtse als door linkse politici. Het was de tijd van de derde weg. Minder overheid en meer zelfredzaamheid. Maar uiteindelijk dus vooral meer consultants.
It's a great honor for me to have Prime Minister Wim Kok here. I always tell everyone that it was he, not I, that was the first real third-way leader in the world.
Was there a specific moment in time you could address?
Well, what's interesting is this has been a slow evolution, and you can't even say kind of right-wing, left-wing, or, So, for example, with Thatcher, it increased massively. I think it went from something like, 10 million to 300 million pounds a year spent by the UK government on consulting, but it actually rose much more than that under Tony Blair, who was a Labour leader. In some ways, the third way, this idea that, no, of course we need government. We are left-wing and we're progressive. We want government, but without actually having a real view of what government is for, we end up almost just bringing in private sector metrics like cost-benefit analysis, net present value analysis inside government institutions. And if it's not oriented and directed towards a public goal, if it's just let's bring in the private sector into health, let's bring in the private sector into transport or into education without saying what are we even trying to do, then it becomes a mess. And this becomes a way open door to the consultants who, of course, have been working in business for a very long time and can easily bring in their PowerPoints and the cost-benefit analysis. And so what you actually require inside governments is the real kind of capacity and capabilities, the outcomes orientation, and the ability to also negotiate and work well with the private sector. You need to be dynamic and agile and flexible, and also to have self-worth, to be confident and negotiate, to see yourself at the center of a value creation system. If value is created in the private sector, there is no public value. The public value then is just to redistribute the value created in the private sector or fix the market failure. So the consulting industry has massively benefited from this weakening of state capacity. And I don't blame them. I think it would be foolish to say this is the consultants' fault. But they have, in a parasitic way, benefited from this weakening and hence also contributed to the further weakening of state capacity. So the question is, why don't we learn? And I think there's several answers to that, but I think the first one is that the fear within governments, that kind of risk averseness, that even when they have the expertise, there's this fear of making a mistake. And it's crazy because, of course, when you're looking for solutions, you will make mistakes. NASA knows, Apollo 1, it blew up, right? So there's many mistakes, learning by doing, trial and error. You can't learn how to ride a bicycle if you don't fall off. So somehow the civil service has been convinced that they're not allowed to make mistakes. So of course, with all that fear, it's easier just to have the rubber stamp of a consulting company.
Yes, for me is good. 11 Houston, thrusters go, all engines, you're looking good.
There's so many failures and also scandals, whether it's McKinsey with the opioid crisis or the failure by McKinsey in Australia to consult in an intelligent way on climate change. So it's been proven time and again that the consultants are bringing very weak understanding. You know, they might browse some reports, but the real kind of deep understanding around climate change is not in McKinsey. Not only do they not have themselves the knowledge, because that's simply not where the expertise sits, but also they have no incentive to make the government more knowledgeable in the next round, more capable, because then they won't get the contract. And it's an industry that survives on those contracts.
Mariana Mazzucato reist de wereld over om haar boodschap te delen, juist ten overstaan van managers en consultants. Ze is in Nederland om een zaal toe te spreken op de Zuidas.
When you go to a talk like this, what are you aiming for? What are you hoping for?
That's a good question. To be a thorn in the side of a lot of people who smile all the time. When they think about the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change, everyone cozies up. And this particular conference is all about rethinking prosperity. But my view, and I've been saying this for a long time, I'm getting tired of saying it, but it's more needed now than ever, is that unless we think the underlying fundamentals of how we have decided wrongly to organize government, how we've decided wrongly to organize business, and especially how they work together terribly, then nothing will change. Yeah, so I don't know why I go to these conferences, to be honest. I should just stay home with my children. But I don't give up hope. That's the thing. I think the only thing that makes me continue to do talks and to go around the world and work with governments is I sincerely, genuinely believe we can do better.
Volgens Mazzucato is een partnership tussen de staat en private partijen geslaagd wanneer de overheid doelgedreven is en de juiste kennis zelf in huis heeft.
We have a very special guest in our midst. She is a world-renowned economist and she is the author of several influential books. I saw some of you bringing them just now to get a little signature in real fast. Well, may we have a very big round of applause, everyone, for none other than Professor Mariana Mazzucato.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. So first of all, great to be here. I think it'd be great if we all stop smiling. Well, sort of. In other words, what I want to talk about is not that things are going very well. I don't think they are. I think we have very problematic relationships and partnerships in our public-private partnerships. The few places that have achieved innovation-led growth, think of Silicon Valley, would have never happened without government investment. Everything in your smartphone that's smart and not stupid was government funded. Internet, GPS, Siri, touchscreen display. But also that it was particular organizations in government that made those investments, and they were goal-oriented, purpose-oriented organizations. The internet came about because the government needed to know how to make the satellites communicate. It was a problem. Internet's the solution. The Navy needed to know where the ships were. GPS is the solution. So the learning from that should have been, how do we build more problem-oriented, purpose-oriented organizations, not only for the military-industrial complex, but for health and all our different social challenges. If public money is being used, whether it's on health or transport or housing, right, these are everyday problems, but the contracts are being structured in very problematic, dysfunctional ways. Socialization of risk, privatization of reward across all those areas, especially the medical field, then the people, the citizens, are getting a very, very bad deal.
Een zwakke overheid die volledig afhankelijk is van externe consultants kan volgens Mazzucato uiteindelijk zelfs de democratie ondermijnen.
If we're going to hold government accountable, first of all, we need to know what government's doing. And if there's a lack of transparency, because the people doing it are consultants who were not voted in to government, right, but kind of find their way through all the woodwork and the cracks, that's a problem of democracy in terms of knowledge of where the decision's being made. It's also a problem because for democracy, we need capable, again, leaders. And if we're outsourcing everything, so we're infantilizing, we're literally turning, our government workers into children. we won't have capable leaders. So you might be voting in a politician, but you would hope that that politician has a whole team to implement what they talked about in the election campaign. If you're campaigning around, for example, the Green Deal, yeah, and maybe you're voted in because of that, or because you say, drill, baby, drill, right? I mean, not everyone is green, for sure. It doesn't matter, though. You come in with a plan, but if you can't implement or even administer the plan because you've stopped investing in your capacity to govern complex systems, then you won't be able to do what you've said you will do, right? So that's also a question of democracy, because citizens are using their vote because they think something will happen, and then, you know, we have very weak systems. All the different actors. Remember, the economy is an outcome of how we decide to govern public institutions, private institutions, third sector institutions, but especially their relationships. And I think we have the wrong relationships, but also the wrong governance structures. So for me, this whole impact...
How do you get this government smarter? Because the smartest people go to the consultancy company.
Yeah, well, they go to the so lots of young people, the smartest young people go to consulting companies. They might go to the tech companies like Google. They might go to the banks like Goldman Sachs. So the problem is not just about consulting, but it is striking, by the way, how in the career fairs of some of the top universities, the consultants are all there, and they're very smart to be there. Why is government not there, by the way? We shouldn't blame the consultants. Government should be there with the different agencies, whether it's a Department of Health or a DARPA-type agency, so an innovation agency. In Sweden, they're called Vinnova. In Finland, it's Sitra. In Chile, it's Corfo, right? You know, these are names you might not even know, but they're really important innovation agencies within government. But if we don't value government, then of course it's not going to be a sexy place to work. Or if you're not allowed to make mistakes. Think of the venture capital sector, which, you know, brags about all the risks they took, and for every successful investment, they say they needed 8 or 9 failures. It's the government's fault to not invest enough in the civil service, to not make it exciting, to not actually say, hey, this is about, you know, embracing uncertainty, not de-risking. We need to take on these risks. We can't be so risk averse. The government has to do that. And if we should also definitely have better salaries, of course. Singapore, by the way, pays the top ministers more than $1 million, but, you know, most countries can't do that.
If we look at the future, how do we stop this explosion of consultants?
Back to the consultants. Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I think of them just as little cockroaches. I mean, they are a problem, but they're not the biggest problem, right? The big problems are also companies like Goldman Sachs and the private equity industry, the hedge fund industry, the big tech companies. The consultants are benefiting from a problematic form of capitalism. They did not cause the problems. So don't even give them credit, right? That's why I say, you know, just go. No.
But if you step on them, yeah, they multiply. So
they multiply, exactly. No, of course it's a problem. I wouldn't have written the book if I don't think the consulting industry is a problem. There's many nice people, by the way, who work in the industry. So it's not about the individuals, you know, all these young talent that's going into consulting. I want them to go into government. But then it's the government's fault to not make government sexier.
And if we don't do that, we end up having only managers and consultants in this world.
We have a lot of aria fritta, yeah, fried air. And yeah, we end up having managers and consultants and advisors that don't know much about what they are advising in.